Welcome to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 240 of the podcast. And on this week's show, I'm talking about the Denver Broncos firing head coach Nathaniel Hackett. The Denver Broncos have fired Hackett before the ending of his first full year as coach. He's only the fourth coach in NFL history to be fired before completing one full season as an NFL head coach. The most recent example was Urban Meyer with the Jaguars last season, just to give you an idea of how disastrous things need to go for a first-year coach to get axed. However, Hackett, unlike Meyer, was not fired for something off the field. What went wrong with the Broncos was on the field. The Broncos were 4-11 under Hackett and offensively averaged 15.5 points per game. That's dead last in the NFL and one of 9 teams to be under 20 points per game. They averaged 209 passing yards per game, 20th in the league, 107.5 rushing yards, that's 22nd, and Denver converts touchdowns less than 52% of the time in the red zone, that's 23rd in the NFL. The Broncos under Hackett were arguably one of the worst offensive teams in the history of the sport, and when Hackett was hired by the Broncos, the media speculated it was to entice Aaron Rodgers to go there due to Hackett's past as the Packers offensive coordinator. What ended up happening was thought to be at the time the second best option. Instead, the Broncos ended up with Super Bowl winning quarterback Russell Wilson, and we all imagine like what happened with Brady and the Buccaneers would happen with Wilson and the Broncos, that Wilson would turn the Broncos into an instant Super Bowl contending team. And what's happened instead is thought to be a future Hall of Famer. Russell Wilson has been the most ridiculed player in 2022. He was called a poser on the NFL Network by Kyle Brandt, which I thought was a bit unfair, and many of his former Seattle Seahawks teammates, including Richard Sherman and Marshawn Lynch, have spoken out against him, saying they have to get in touch with his representatives just to talk to him. And a lot of this is Wilson's own fault. For instance, Wilson has continued to use the ridiculous catchphrase Broncos country, let's ride, and was working out during a flight. Wilson used to be viewed as a winner. Now he's looked at as an overpaid celebrity quarterback. Wilson signed a 5-year, $242 million deal, 161 of which is fully guaranteed. Many are calling what has happened to Wilson the fastest drop-off by a star quarterback ever. He isn't super old like Peyton Manning or Brett Favre, so you wouldn't expect such a drastic decline in performance. Wilson is 34 years of age. He's not super old, yet he only has 12 passing touchdowns on the season. Here's what I think has happened in the NFL. We all thought that because of guys like Tom Brady and Drew Brees, who played very well later into their careers, that every quarterback would start to play longer and longer. Like we almost expect almost 40-year-old quarterbacks to be elite players, and now guys like Russell Wilson is struggling and he's only 34 years old because Tom Brady and Drew Brees are not the new norms. They were unicorns, and I don't think we're ever going to see players like that again. Maybe we shouldn't be so shocked that Russell Wilson is declining in his mid-30s. I mean, this is a guy who was a running type quarterback. He hasn't always been the best passer of all time. Should we really be all that surprised that he isn't aging very well as a player? I also go against this idea that this taints what happened with Seattle. The Seattle Seahawks were almost a nothing franchise before Russell Wilson got there. They had gone to one Super Bowl with Matt Hasselbeck. That happened. They were not a very good franchise. They did not have star players. Russell Wilson is one of the biggest reasons why that franchise won a Super Bowl. They were not going to win without Russell Wilson. I understand they had a great defense with Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor. They had an all-time defense. I love that team, but I don't think they win a Super Bowl without Russell Wilson. I think he was a key component to that team winning a Super Bowl. Now, do I think Russell Wilson is one of the best quarterbacks to ever play in the history of football? Absolutely not. But I don't think his Hall of Fame caliber legacy in Seattle should be affected by what's happening with the Denver Broncos. Historically, throughout the NFL, quarterbacks do not do great on a second NFL team. They don't win again. The Tom Brady's and the Peyton Mannings winning a Super Bowl with a second team just doesn't happen all the time. Now, did we all think Russell Wilson was going to win a Super Bowl immediately? I never thought that. But I also could not have expected him being this bad early on in his career with the Denver Broncos. It's gone to the point where it's fair to ask the question, are we ever going to see the old Russell Wilson again? And nobody knows the answer to that. I just believe we all have in our minds that a quarterback is now going to be great for a 15-year plus period of time, and I don't think that's realistic. We're used to seeing it with Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, and Aaron Rodgers, but those type of quarterbacks are few and far between. You're not going to see guys like Drew Brees much longer. Like, I don't even think Patrick Mahomes is going to be great a decade from now. I don't think you're going to see quarterbacks great into their 40s anymore like Tom Brady. I don't think we should be that surprised that Russell Wilson is declining at age 34. This is the sport of football. He's taking hits. He's not the same player, and his game, more like those other guys I mentioned, was based off of athleticism. And another reason why so many people are piling on is because what's happening with the Seahawks. They have been a pretty decent team this year with a chance to make the playoffs with Geno Smith as their quarterback. So people are comparing Russell Wilson and Geno Smith. I just think the thing has gone a bit off track. I think we should focus on Russell Wilson's play and leave all that other stuff behind. It doesn't matter what he did with the Seahawks. All that matters now is what he's going to be like at the end of his career with the Denver Broncos. Yes, at the beginning of the season, I thought Russell Wilson was a no-doubt Hall of Fame player. He's won a Super Bowl. He went to another one. His legacy with the Seahawks is cemented. He's one of the best Seahawks, if not the best Seahawk of all time. But this year is really starting to put into question how great a player he is. And if he's one of those transcendent quarterbacks that can win with any team and make anyone better. I mean, if you thought he was one of those guys, this year is going to put that into question, but I still believe in my heart that he is a Hall of Fame level quarterback. There are so many quarterbacks in the Hall of Fame that have done far less in the sport of football than Russell Wilson. And I've heard so many analysts say this year, that he was a product of Seattle. What was the Seattle Seahawks? Before they drafted Russell Wilson, they were a nothing NFL franchise that had just paid Matt Flynn, of all people, a boatload of money to be their starter, and then they made the move to Wilson, and he helped turn their franchise around. It's not like he left an all-time great team that was stacked full of talent. Like, if Tom Brady had left the Patriots and then stunk, then yeah, you could have made the case that maybe Brady was a product of the Patriots because he was leaving a dynasty. But Brady, like Wilson, was the best player in franchise history. It is crazy, all the people saying Russell Wilson was a product of the Seattle Seahawks. Like, the Seahawks were one of these all-time great teams before Wilson got there. He deserves just as much credit as Pete Carroll, Richard Sherman, Marshawn Lynch. He was a key component in that team, winning a Super Bowl and making another one. And he kept that team afloat. I think those Seahawks teams in the last few years would not have made the postseason without Russell Wilson. He was an elite quarterback and an MVP caliber player. Let's not forget that just because he's having his worst season as a member of the Denver Broncos. This is a real turning point for Wilson's career in Denver. If he goes back to being the Russell Wilson from Seattle, we will look at this year as a blip and Hackett's fault. If, however, his downward spiral continues, his legacy will continue to be tarnished. tarnished. And something I don't get about this situation is why some people are rooting for the downfall of Russell Wilson. I was really a fan of this guy. I don't care that a lot of you view him as a celebrity quarterback. Is he kind of a corny guy when he talks? Absolutely. But as a player, he was really exciting. He was a winner. He helped turn that Seahawks team around. I'm rooting for him to turn it around in Denver because I believe in him as a player. I think it's easy to call a guy a bad teammate when he's playing really bad at the sport he's playing. I have no idea how Russell Wilson interacts with his teammates. It doesn't look good on paper, but nothing looked good for the Denver Broncos. They were 4-11. Nothing looked good. Maybe they'll turn it around. Maybe the Russell Wilson we see right now is not the Russell Wilson we'll see to end his career. I'm holding out hope that we will see some signs next year that Russell Wilson is on the way back to being the Russell Wilson that won a Super Bowl. With Nathaniel Hackett gone, there's already a lot of talk over who should be the next head coach for the Broncos, and the most popular name has been former Saints coach Sean Payton. It makes a lot of sense, and if anyone could turn Wilson's career around, you'd think it would be him. It sounds outlandish to say out loud, but next year is going to be the most important year of Russell Wilson's career, and a lot of people, like I said, are rooting against him, and bringing Sean Payton makes a lot of sense because he had a lot of success with Drew Brees at the later stage of his career. Payton definitely knows how to coach quarterbacks. I thought he did a really good job with Jameis Winston. I think this is a guy, even when Taysom Hill was playing the position at times, the Saints looked like a very good team. Teddy Bridgewater, this guy can win games with any quarterback. So I feel like he could get the very best out of Russell Wilson, no matter what Wilson has to offer for the rest of his career. I think at the very least, Sean Payton could make the Broncos a 500 team next year, which they need to be. They need to make that jump. Listen, the Broncos are not going to go from a 4-11 team to a Super Bowl contending team. That's not going to happen. The Broncos are never going to be as good as some people thought they were going to be when they brought in Russell Wilson. They just need to make next year a positive year for everyone. They need to get Russell Wilson to be confident again, and they need to start winning football games. In all likelihood, they're never going to win a Super Bowl with Russell Wilson as their quarterback. I mean, that would be a gigantic turnaround. What a story that would be. I would love it, but I just don't see that happening anytime in the near future. They just need to make it so the next 3 to 4 years with Russell Wilson as their quarterback are functional, because last year they were a dysfunctional organization. Again, one of the worst offenses in the history of all of football, and the man who can turn it around is definitely Sean Payton. Heading into this year's NFL season, all the talk was how great the AFC West was going to be, and two of the teams, the Raiders and Broncos, have been underwhelming to say the least, and the Chargers are just barely a playoff team. The Chiefs are still far and away the best team in the division, and this is yet another example of how splashy off seasons mean absolutely nothing when it comes to winning. Remember, the Raiders got Devontae Adams, the Chargers brought in J.C. Jackson, the Broncos traded for Russell Wilson, and the Chiefs lost Tyreek Hill and still remain the top dog in the division. That's super impressive, and it's getting overlooked. The NFL is a sport where continuity matters. You build towards winning. You don't just sign a Russell Wilson or a J.C. Jackson and become Super Bowl contenders. You don't just trade for Devontae Adams and then become a great team. Yes, on your way to becoming a great team, you can make a trade to put you over the edge, but you're not just going to instantly become a great NFL team by acquiring one player. It's not like basketball. As bad as Russell Wilson was this season, he's not the difference of why the Broncos are really bad. He's had a bad year, but clearly the Denver Broncos were not a Russell Wilson away from being an all-time great football team, because if they were, they wouldn't be 4-11. I'm sure Broncos fans thought that Wilson would end up being exactly like Peyton Manning and turning the team around, but Peyton Manning is an all-time top 10 quarterback, and clearly Russell Wilson is not that, and he doesn't have guys like Demaryius Thomas or Wes Welker. The Broncos do not have that type of talent on offense. I do think you can put a positive spin on where the Broncos are at right now and say they only have to become an average offense to be a playoff caliber team, because let's be honest, if the team averaged 20 points per game this year, they would be far and away a playoff team. This year in the NFL has been rough. I think there are a lot of bad teams in the NFL and not a lot of good teams, so the Broncos are not that far away from being a playoff team. But I'll say this again, they are far and away from being a Super Bowl winning team, and I don't see that ever happening with Russell Wilson as a member of the Denver Broncos. Sadly, I want it to happen. I like Russell Wilson. I think he's a winner, but they're not going to win a Super Bowl. But can at the very least they get back to being a playoff team? I don't think that's very far away, but I think that says more where the NFL is at than how good I think the Denver Broncos can be. The Broncos only need to be an average offense to win more games, and I think they can get that, especially if they bring in a head coach like Sean Payton, or even a better offensive coordinator, somebody who can get the very best out of Russell Wilson. He doesn't need to be great next year. He just needs to be a guy who can throw 25 touchdowns in a season and not 12. That's a pitiful number. You're not going to win averaging under 16 points per game. You need to get that number up to 20. You have a good enough defense. You need to win 10 games next year, and I think it's possible. If they have an average offense, they win at least 10. We can all blame Hackett and Wilson all we want, but we also have to blame the Broncos as an organization. When you hire a coach and fire him in the first season, that's dysfunctional, and as a franchise, they feel way off from that team that won a Super Bowl with Peyton Manning. They feel lost as a franchise. They thought Russell Wilson was going to be the savior. That was their main plan. You should always have more than one path to being a very good football team. It also feels like the Broncos did not put Wilson in the best situation. Clearly, him and Hackett did not get along, and Hackett did not know how to get the best out of Russell Wilson. A lot of people have said Wilson looked completely confused out there at times this season. That has to be on Hackett as a head coach. So clearly, those two never got together to make this work out. It feels like the Broncos had the attitude that all of their problems were erased once they brought in Russell Wilson, and I thought that was the absolute wrong attitude to have, because he's clearly not a savior-like quarterback like Peyton Manning or Tom Brady. He's not that guy. I really believe that their biggest issue was believing they were a quarterback away from being an elite team. Trading for an established quarterback almost never leads to winning. Tom Brady and Peyton Manning are outliers, not the standards. Yes, we all thought Russell Wilson would have been a lot better than he's been with the Broncos, but I never believed they were a legitimate Super Bowl winning team. I thought they were on the way to building it. I thought possibly they could be a playoff team because I believed in Russell Wilson as a winner, but clearly things did not go right for the Broncos this year. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. It's always funny to see that when teams go bad, the first one they blame is the head coach, and then if next year it continues to go bad, you know who they'll go for next. They'll go for Russell Wilson, but it should really be the fault of the people who brought those two together and thought that this was going to work. The Broncos deserve a majority of the blame for what has happened to them as a franchise, and the people who run the franchise, I blame more than I blame Nathaniel Hackett or Russell Wilson. In my opinion, Wilson to the Broncos never made sense. I think he should have just waited and gone to a bigger market team. He clearly does want to be a semi-celebrity quarterback. Go to the Jets. Go to a team in New York. Go to the Giants if they get rid of Daniel Jones. Wait for New York, but he had to be a Bronco, and now I bet he's regretting that decision. As for Hackett, they clearly didn't believe in him because they didn't let him have one bad season. I mean, Jimmy Johnson was terrible his first year with the Dallas Cowboys, but they kept him and remained winners. By letting go of Hackett, you're almost admitting you only brought him there to get Aaron Rodgers to go to the team, that you never believed him as a head coach. I look at Nathaniel Hackett as a victim of circumstances. And when teams with expectations are bad, the first one to get the blame is the coach. coach. It's going to be interesting to see if there is a head coach out there who can turn the Broncos around and make them at least an average football team. All eyes are going to be on Russell Wilson next year to see if this is who he is now. It feels like it can't get any worse for Wilson and the Broncos, and that it can only go up from here. Thanks for listening to this edition of Head to Head. I'm Cam McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, so please rate, review, and subscribe.